Our next speaker in this segment is Nathan how do you pronounce your surname?
Zamprogno.
Zamprogno. The G is silent. Thank you. Over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for hearing me today. I'd like to follow on and provide just another case study, the reason why these conferences are needed, the reasons why there needs to be better laws against cults. Before I start, I'd like to recognise the presence of the Federal Member for Macquarie, Louise Marcus, in the audience, whose integrity and whose trenchant support for families I have come to respect very much. Thank you for being with me. My name is Nathan Zamprogno. I'm 38. I live in Sydney. I'm not a lawyer or a psychologist. I'm an ordinary man to whom extraordinary things have happened, to my family particularly. The story that I have to tell you is not a story of my involvement in a cult, but of something that has happened to my family. The worst horror stories are those that begin with an everyday setting and where the familiar gradually gives way to the sinister. In late 2008, I was in the 10th year of my marriage. That's me, that's my beautiful now ex-wife Kylie, and our little boy Liam. I'd worked in the same job for 10 years as the IT manager in a private school. We were anchored in our community, in a local church, a church that we'd both been members of since our teens. We had a range of outside interests. My wife played soccer. I trod the boards with a local dramatic society. I ticked all the boxes. Station wagon, mortgage, kid. And we had every reason to wake up every morning and count the blessings in our life. My son had completed kindergarten, and when my wife wanted to get back into her career, she landed a dream job for her, and that is working as an administrator in the emergency department of a local major hospital. Unfortunately, however, there was a cloud on our horizon, and that is that my beautiful bride had been subject to episodes of mental illness on occasion. This was not something that we stigmatised. You bear one another's burdens, as you ought to, and we prayed for better times and usually got there. Led her back to a place of wholeness and healing with the support of family and with professional help. Unfortunately, at the cusp of just such an episode of illness in her life, she became befriended by a group that were in the outer orbit of the school where I worked. And they started to invite her along to Bible studies or women's groups. And these outings became later and later with no explanation until the day came where I was home. She'd taken our only car out. Midnight had come and gone. There was no sign of her. I had a sleeping child in his bed, and I didn't know whether she was dead on the side of the road or something. But on occasions like that, and there were a couple before she disappeared completely, where I'd get a text, not a phone call, but a text, and not from her phone, but from one of the ladies in the group that she'd joined, that said, Kylie's in a bit of a state, involved in some heavy counselling. She'll be home in the morning. And there was a day on the 4th of January 2009 where she said, I'm going to my Bible study group. I'll be back in time for dinner. And our then 6-year-old son and I waved her off as she drove down the driveway. And that was on the 4th of January 2009, and she's never been home since. I later discovered that she had become a victim of a phenomenon called the false memory syndrome, or a belief in what's called ritual satanic abuse. What happens when this phenomenon occurs is that a group has read one of a couple of the key texts of these movements. One's called Courage to Heal, the other one's called He Came to Set the Captives Free. If you present to a group that have read and believed these texts, you might present with some kind of an emotional issue. You might actually be mentally ill, diagnosed or undiagnosed, but the fact that you carry this emotional baggage is invariably interpreted as you repressing the memory of being quite horrifically abused, sexually abused, physically abused. Very frequently the abuse has an occult character to it, and that you have repressed those memories so thoroughly that as an adult you have no recollection of them. More specifically, that this abuse has invariably occurred at the hands of family members, and that even if, as an adult, despite your difficulties, you have a warm and loving relationship with your family, is that you need to immediately suspect your family as being the perpetrators of this abuse. These people had taken it upon themselves to diagnose my wife with something called Dissociative Identity Disorder. It's what used to be called multiple personality syndrome. And they had no professional qualification to make such a diagnosis, obviously. And the model that they employ, I'll explain what that is in a second. I'm sorry, could I have some water, please? Yeah, thank you. Is that a person's personality has fragmented, that they've divided into parts in order to protect themselves from the traumatic memories of the abuse that they had been subjected to. This diagram that came my way is a map of my wife's mind. The larger partitions represent rooms, and the tiny little pinpricks represent individual personalities. Scores, hundreds of them, which had to be dealt with. How were they dealt with? One was called Hope and had the gift of prophecy, and my wife was encouraged to prophesy and speak directly with Jesus and then relay whatever it was that Jesus was saying to the group. And others were given names. Some of the personalities, unfortunately, however, were demonic. You could have passengers. And of course, the only remedy for demonic possession is exorcism. So my wife was subjected to exorcism. My wife was the most gregarious, community-minded, family-oriented, fiercely maternal, practical and grounded woman I ever knew. And that's what I fell in love with. And I suppose one of my messages is that anybody can fall for this at a point of great vulnerability in their life. That's difficult to read, but it's indicative of the accusations that my wife had been encouraged to make, generally and specifically against members of her own family. I'm just going to skate through them. I mean, some of the personalities that my wife was encouraged to manifest were of an infantile character. And indeed, the personality that they declared was going to be her healed personality was originally portrayed to me as having the emotional age of a 5-year-old. Anything that I suppose could reinforce the need for the group to protect her. My wife was encouraged to believe, for example, that she had been buried alive with a dead baby, that she had been taken out of her bed and taken to secluded bush locations where hooded figures, coven members, satanic figures, would force her to watch people being murdered. This is in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. People having their throat slit, people having explosives jammed down their throat and detonated, a man having his hands thrust into an industrial blender, and then the liquid was poured over her, that she was repeatedly raped by other people and with sticks, that she was smeared with faeces, that she had scalding water poured in her ear, and a range of other things. That's merely the tip of the iceberg, but I don't want to go on about it. It's too distressing, and indeed it's disgusting. Now, of course, this isn't true. My wife was never subjected to any such abuse, but my wife was encouraged to believe and to recount in ever more lurid detail these offences against her, and their great sin, of course, against my wife was to pervert the course of her medical and psychological care when obviously she was at the point of that great vulnerability. Another thing that the group that my wife now lives with believes is that they were engaged in spiritual warfare with covens up and down the Blue Mountains and elsewhere, and that using their spiritual discernment that they could identify coven members by their name, by the location of the coven that they were a member of, what they did for a living, how old they were, what their physical appearance was, their level within the coven, and the nature of the malady that they brought to visit upon my wife and indeed the group more broadly. This happened invisibly. They were termed astral travellers, and you'll see that in that middle block there, the name Linda is actually my aunt, who invisibly sailed from her home to twist my wife's fallopian tubes psychically. So apparently not only was my wife's family full of Satanists, but my family was as well. This is indicative of the paranoid and delusional mentality that these groups believe in. There's more of that. I'm just going to skate over that. This one was an interesting favourite though. If you ever see a clothesline rotating in the absence of a strong breeze, that is apparently indicative of strong spiritual activity in the area. Now, and the last thing, of course, is that my wife was told that her own name, Kylie, was a hateful name that had been given to her at birth because it contained the word lie in it, and that therefore my wife had to adopt a new identity called Hopi. This was a name that was given to her by the cult, and this isn't a person that I know. The great tragedy, of course, is that there is a lady out there who is suffering very badly, who is very much a victim in this, who bears my wife's face, but isn't a person that I or my wife's family really recognise anymore. My wife lost her job, she disappeared effectively without trace, and I then set out to try and work out what on earth had gone on. As it turns out, my wife had been taken down to a group here in Canberra called the Shepherd's Heart Church, run by a couple called John and Glenys Darnell. They have a therapy program for people that suffer from ritual satanic abuse, and they have a ministry program for those people. They employ a pseudo-medical, pseudo-psychological terminology, enough to pass the muster of a psychologist or a GP, because I've got letters from both of those people to say that this is the therapy that my wife is sitting under and it's okay with them. So what do these people believe? Well, for one thing, they believe that if you have multiple personalities, it may indeed be true that some of them are demonic. This is an extract from their ministry program, from their therapy book, their manual, and that those demons need to be exorcised. Furthermore, some women, not all of them, but some women have endured abuse so horrific that they have been kidnapped by demonically piloted UFOs and taken to a secret underground base in Mount Hermon in Israel, where they were impregnated with half demon, half human embryos, some of which are brought to term and walk the earth today as creatures called Nephilim. They're kind of demonic super soldiers, and some of which are harvested before term for undisclosed and yet more nefarious purposes. What was the reaction of the group to my attempts to seek justice? Well, the first mistake they made was to write down what they thought about me. Nathan getting info about our church, blah, blah, blah. No weapon formed against us will prosper. They're going to hang themselves. Tips to stop Nathan. He has set his own course of destruction, etc., etc. They would have kittens if they knew that I had this. They would have puppies if they knew that I was presenting it here, and they would have elephants if they knew that I'd given this to a current affair yesterday. It's not the only threat that I've received from this group. I also received legal threats. How dare I suggest that this group were a cult? I'd said as much in a court, which is protected speech, while I was fighting for the custody of my son, which I got. And I'd like to assert here at this point that I have a right to speak for justice for my family, and I am not afraid of this organisation one little bit. But there is a human tragedy behind all of this. That's my boy, that's Kylie, that's her sisters and her mum. My boy has lost a mother. My wife's family have lost a daughter, a sister, an auntie, a granddaughter. She's missed weddings, the birth of 3 nieces and nephews, won't have anything to do with her family. And I've lost my soulmate. I grieve about that every day. But before we all get too morose and you all slit your wrists, I'd like to let you know that we're through the worst of this, and I and my boy are doing very well. We've had tremendous support from family, including from my wife's family. I'm completing my masters at uni. I'm engaged in politics. I'm engaged in my local community, and I am committed to the fight for justice, and I'm very grateful for the existence of an organisation like CIFS that I can throw my lot in with. It is a great comfort to know that I am not alone. Stephen Much made some mention this morning of the efforts that we've all gone to collectively to try and work out what government response is possible. I've written to every Attorney-General and every Shadow Attorney-General in Australia. Some of them haven't returned my letters or my calls. Some of them have. I've gone through traditional mechanisms of complaint, the Healthcare Complaints Commission, the Health Services Commissioner here in the ACT. I've done that research into the model criminal code that was penned by the Standing Committee of Attorneys General. This is ongoing work. My closing remarks are these. I believe that there are very many more of these smaller fly-by-night groups that don't have the high profile of the Scientologists or the Exclusive Brethren, even though we do need to go after those groups. They are grossly manipulating people psychologically. They are causing families to be broken up. There is a profound gap in the law. If you inflict a sexual abuse or a financial fraud or common assault against somebody, the law will bring you to book. But if you are the victim of this kind of gross psychological abuse of the type that I've just described, there is a gap in the law. There must be a law against psychological abuse. There must be better powers for these other methods of complaint so that they actually do something when you go to them with a complaint. I fully support all of the ideas and initiatives that have been proposed at the conference here today. My family story alone, let alone the other horrible stories that we've heard, show that existing laws are inadequate, and that to say that the existing laws are adequate, as indeed, like the Standing Committee of Attorneys General met back in March, told me that they'd considered this at length, but their communique ran to one line. That line says, "We believe existing laws are adequate." Please write to your MPs. Please tell your stories. Please maintain the courage that it takes not to flag in those efforts. It's very easy to retreat into your shell and to just exist and to try and heal with your families. We need to do more. Again, permit me to thank CIFS and the organisers of this conference for doing all that you've done, and that concludes my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for a very well presented but very upsetting story, and it certainly behoves all of us to write our stories down and to pursue this battle as much as we can.